he had increasingly a problem with his legs. And he also suffered really badly from constipation.
The king is dead, but his body isn't resting at all. Imagine the shock when workers found a royal vault that looked like a bomb went off. It's the most disturbing discovery in history because the coffin didn't just break, it self-destructed.
One of the strange things about Henry is that we don't really know what he dies of.
There's a dark, hardened puddle on the stone and bones scattered in the dust where they don't belong. This is the story of how the biggest ego in history met the most embarrassing and messy end possible. You'll never look at the royal family the same way again after seeing this. Shattered royal resting place. The way they found the vault changed everything about the king's history and revealed a secret that stayed hidden for centuries. When a group of workers was busy fixing up the floor of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle in 1813, they had no idea they were about to walk into a nightmare. They were trying to build a new passage to another tomb nearby when their tools accidentally broke through a wall of brick. As the dust settled, they saw a dark, hollow space that hadn't been seen by human eyes for over 100 years. They didn't know it yet, but they'd just stumbled into the final resting place of the most famous man to ever wear the crown. When the surveyor finally went down there with a lantern, he didn't find the royal glory he expected. Instead, he saw a scene that looked more like a violent struggle than a burial. The vault was small, cramped, and filled with the debris of a broken history. The center of the room was taken up by a massive lead coffin that was supposed to hold the remains of the king. But it wasn't a neat and tidy box anymore. The lead was torn and jagged, looking like it had been shredded by a giant. It was tilted at a weird angle and sitting in a way that made no sense. This lead box weighed more than 1,000 pounds, yet it had been tossed around like a toy. It's not that simple though, because the damage wasn't from people breaking in. The metal had actually burst from the internal pressure of the body decaying over hundreds of years. The gas had built up to such an extreme level that the thick lead walls simply couldn't hold it back anymore. It was a biological explosion in slow motion. As the light from the lantern swept across the floor, the surveyor saw something that made his stomach turn. Sticking out of the jagged hole in the metal was a thick, heavy human bone. It was undeniably part of the king's leg, but it wasn't just sitting there. It looked like it had been forced out by the sheer power of the blast. Scattered in the dust around the coffin were other smaller bones. Finger bones and pieces of a hand were lying in the dirt, making it look like the king had literally fallen apart. The crazy part is that Henry wasn't alone in that mess. On one side of him lay Jane Seymour, his favorite wife. Her coffin was in perfect condition, totally untouched by time. On the other side was Charles I, the king who lost his head during the Civil War. His coffin was old and battered, but it was still in one piece. Only Henry's box had been destroyed. It was as if his own body had turned against him even after he passed away. Everyone's obsessed with the fancy portraits of the Tudors, but the reality inside that vault was a total mess. The surveyor also noticed a dark, dried substance on the floor near the cracks in the lead. It looked like old fluid that had leaked out and hardened over the years. This matched the terrifying stories people had whispered for 300 years. The discovery turned a simple building project into a cold case investigation that shocked the world. Who was the mystery intruder and why did the king end up in such a shattered state? To understand why it ended this badly, we have to look at the last days of the king's life. The nightmare didn't start in the tomb because it actually began while the king was still breathing. Rotting ruler's final days. The king's health was failing in a way that made everyone in the palace live in constant fear. Henry VIII was a massive man by the end of his life, weighing nearly 400 pounds. He was so big that his staff had to build special wooden cranes just to lift him out of his bed every morning. But his weight was just the beginning of the problem. His legs were covered in deep, weeping ulcers that just wouldn't heal no matter what the doctors tried. This was probably because of bad circulation or maybe type 2 diabetes, but back then they had no clue what it was. They just knew the smell was unbearable. People wrote that you could smell the king coming from several rooms away because the infection was so bad. Some experts today think he might have had a rare genetic condition called McLeod syndrome, which would explain his weight, his leg problems, and why he became so paranoid. Whatever the cause was, his body was already breaking down while he was still alive. When he finally passed away in January of 1547, the people in charge of the funeral had a huge problem. Embalming in the 16th century wasn't exactly a science. It was more like a messy kitchen recipe using spices, oils, wax, and layers of linen. They did their best to stop the rot, but the king's body was already full of fluids and infection. They wrapped him up and sealed him inside that giant lead box, thinking the metal would keep everything contained. They soldered the seams shut to make it airtight, which is hands down the worst thing they could have done. Airtight containers and rotting matter create gas, and that gas needs a place to go. The coffin was basically a ticking time bomb. The trouble started during the long journey to Windsor Castle. The procession had to stop for the night at a place called Sion Abbey. According to several accounts from that night, something truly disturbing happened while the coffin sat in the middle of the church. In the quiet hours of the night, guards heard strange creaking and groaning noises coming from the box. Then they saw a dark fluid seeping out of the seams and pooling on the stone floor. It gets even worse. Some stories say that stray dogs got into the church and started licking up the fluid that leaked from the king. People were horrified because there was an old prophecy that said dogs would lick the king's blood. Whether the dog part is 100% true or just a dramatic story, it shows how unstable the body was. They cleaned up the mess as fast as they could and rushed to Windsor to get him underground before anything else happened. They lowered him into a temporary vault in the middle of the chapel. It was never supposed to be his forever home, but it ended up that way by accident. Even as they lowered the box, the attendants were worried because they could feel the pressure building. They dropped the stone slab and walked away, hoping the problem was solved. The king expected a monument that would last forever, but his plans for glory disappeared into thin air. Recycled King's Final Home. Henry didn't just want a grave, he wanted a monument that would make every other king look small. He had an ego the size of a planet and wanted a final resting place that reflected his power. His father had a nice chapel at Westminster Abbey, but Henry wanted something bigger and more intimidating. He wanted a tomb that would remind everyone that he was the most powerful man to ever live. So here's the deal, he didn't even design it himself. He actually stole it from his former right-hand man, Cardinal Wolsey. The cardinal was incredibly rich and had started building a magnificent tomb for himself with Italian sculptors and the best black marble. But when Wolsey failed to get the king a divorce, Henry turned on him and took everything he owned, including the tomb. Henry decided the original design was too small and ordered a new one that was basically the original on steroids. He wanted it to be topped with a life-size statue of himself sitting on a horse and covered in gold. There were going to be 144 brass statues surrounding the main monument. Think about that for a second. 144 statues of saints and angels all looking at the king. Workshops all over the country spent years making the parts. They cast giant bronze candlesticks that weighed hundreds of pounds and carved beautiful pillars. They even made a full-size statue of the king while he was still alive, so the face would be perfect. It was going to be the eighth wonder of the world. The gold and metal alone would be worth tens of millions of dollars today. But then reality hit because war is very expensive. Henry loved fighting France and Scotland almost as much as he loved getting married, and his wars drained the treasury. The payments to the artists started to slow down and then they stopped completely. The Italian sculptor got tired of waiting for his money and just went home. The unfinished tomb sat in pieces in a warehouse like a giant Lego set that nobody knew how to put together. When the king passed away, his will said they had to finish it, but his son Edward died young. Then Queen Mary had too many other problems to deal with. Finally, Queen Elizabeth I looked at the bill for the tomb and said no thanks. The greatest tomb in history was sold off piece by piece. The black marble base was eventually used centuries later for the tomb of Lord Nelson in St. Paul's Cathedral. The brass statues were melted down and the gold was stripped away. The monument that was supposed to make the king immortal just ceased to exist. This meant he was stuck in that cramped temporary vault at Windsor forever. The temporary solution became a permanent accident. He was left in a hole that was too small for his ego and apparently too small for his coffin. A political crisis brought a new guest into the dark vault in the middle of the night. Shoving the dead aside. Fast forward about 100 years to 1649 when England was in total chaos. They had just removed the head of King Charles I, and the people in charge had a big problem. They had a dead king on their hands, and they were terrified that a public funeral would start a revolution. They needed to bury him somewhere quiet where nobody could find him. They chose Windsor Castle because it was a secure fortress far away from the angry mobs in London. A small group of loyal followers brought the body to the castle in the dead of winter while it was snowing. The castle was dark and they had to work fast to avoid making a scene. They started looking for a place to dig and tapped on the floor of the chapel to listen for a hollow sound. Eventually, they found a spot near the center and pried up the heavy stones. They realized they had stumbled into the forgotten vault of Henry VIII. It had been sealed for an entire century, and nobody had been down there since the king was first dropped in. There was no time to be polite because they had to get the body underground before someone changed their mind. They lowered the lead box into the small opening, but the vault was tiny. It was only meant for 2 people, and it was already very cramped. The men were struggling with the heavy weight in the dark and cold. To make room for the new guests, they had to shuffle things around. This is when the real damage likely happened. Henry's coffin was already weakened by the internal gas pressure and the rot. When the men tried to wedge the new box in, they likely shoved the old one aside. They probably used it as a ledge to help them lower the other coffin. The wooden supports holding the king up were old and rotten from the damp air. Under the force of the new weight and the rough handling, the wood gave way. There was a massive crash as the lead box slammed to the floor. That impact was the final straw. The lead split open and the sides buckled out. The explosion that the surveyor saw years later probably happened right then. They didn't stop to fix it, they just pushed the other king into place and sealed the hole. It's a strange irony that the man who made the monarchy all-powerful is lying next to the man who lost it all. They were roommates in a dark, broken hole in the ground. The men put the stones back and left no marker at all. The vault went silent again and the world forgot where it was until a clumsy workman made a big mistake. Does a king who lived with such a huge ego deserve such a messy and broken ending? Do you think those mystery bones belong to a forgotten royal child or just a random stranger? Let us know your theories in the comments and hit that like button and subscribe for more dark secrets.